Over 50 religious and lay leaders representing different faiths and denominations across the region met in Port of Spain in February 2017 for a two-day consultation session. The consultation was hosted by the Pan-Caribbean Partnership Against HIV and AIDS, PANCAP, and co-funded by the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, and also the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Quoting PANCAP's director, Mr. Derek Springer, the consultation is for Caribbean faith leaders by faith leaders, given the crucial role of the faith community in ending AIDS. The 1990 target set basically envision zero infections of HIV by 2030. The consultation focused on the faith leaders' contributions to end the epidemic, specifically addressing the recommendations from the UN High-Level 2016 Political Declaration and to agree on strategies to promote healthy living for all age groups, review best practices, identify gaps to be filled, resources required, and types of regional cooperation. What role does this organization play in, and I want to use a heavy word here, combating HIV, the fight against HIV, prevention of HIV, and what message are we sending? Sure.
I think the role of the faith community in combating, if we use a military term, or to combating the epidemic of HIV is to care for people. I'd put it as simple as that, because AIDS is a human epidemic, and the faith community is about saving people. It is about the well-being of people. It is about the welfare of people, and therefore anything that affects people negatively, the faith community is duty-bound to respond to that. Now, clearly, we're not, unless we're equipped with hospitals and so on, as some faith communities do. For the most part, what it therefore means is partnership. We're going to have to partner with other people, because we have to bring the faith and the science together to combat, because this is a war in a sense, and therefore it needs all the tools of the trade of war to make it possible. And therefore I think the faith community can lead in the fight against HIV through partnerships.
Do you think that this partnership can end the AIDS epidemic by 2030?
Yes.
Given the 1990 targets? I mean, we have 55 religious leaders, well, faith-based leaders here from all across the region. And I know the intention is really to work together. How can we come together to combat, to fight HIV?
Absolutely.
Do you think this is something that can happen? Because everyone has a different view.
Yes. Well, all the evidence is showing that it is not just possible, but it is actually happening. So this is not something we're imposing on Caribbean reality. Already, mother-to-child transmission is almost zero. So the evidence is showing that with effective intervention, it is being done. So what we have to do is scale up the partnership. So the faith community can do quite a bit more. We've been doing it, but we can do quite a bit more in terms of prevention. And right now we know that once a person is diagnosed with HIV, they go immediately on treatment, and that can suppress the infection, so that a person who has HIV doesn't have to pass it on in terms of unprotected sex and so on. So what we do know is that the entire population needs to know, every person in the population needs to know his or her status. So at this consultation, for example, we have a parallel testing opportunity where faith leaders make themselves available for voluntary testing.
That's excellent.
To show that, it doesn't destroy you when you do an HIV test. But also, more importantly, we are leading by example. Because the more persons know, that's one of the 90 focus, the more persons know their status, and particularly for those who are positive, they go immediately on treatment. We can say by 2030, no more AIDS in the Caribbean. And it's not a pipe dream, it is actually happening now.
It appears as though we are definitely looking at that distinct possibility of having zero infections by 2030. This should have happened 20 years ago?
Yes.
Do you think so?
Yes.
Or is there any particular reason why it's happening now?
Yes.
And why we didn't think about this back then? Is
Yes.
it that our mindset about HIV was totally different?
So, well, we have had an approach to fighting epidemics in the region. Cholera, yellow fever, etc., malaria. They all come with different kinds of fear factor, etc. And HIV is no different. When it came, you know, it was the end of the world, it was a homosexual disease, and so on and so forth. So it took us a while to settle down. We respect and remember those who died in the cause and, you know, in the early days. But I think the legacy that they have given to us is that we need to be more caring, as I said, from the beginning. And that is a lesson that should not be lost on us now. And therefore I think we have that legacy to propel us forward. So yes, 20 years too late, but I think 20 years is enough time for us to, you know, really increase the momentum in eliminating AIDS from the Caribbean.
Allow me to get just a little bit controversial here. My last question. Jamaica, how is it? Jamaica sometimes appears to be extremely homophobic.
Sure.
How do the young ones deal with that? Those, you know, the population,
Sure.
how do they deal with that element of stigma and discrimination? And how do you,
Sure.
in terms of, you know, your faith as a pastor, how do you mentor these individuals? How do you keep them together?
Sure. I think it's fair to say that sex and sexuality has traditionally been a very interesting subject in the Caribbean. We have ways of valorizing it. You have carnival here, and, you know, you see people gyrating on the streets. So there's one side of the discourse that finds sex very attractive. You know, it's a very public display, etc. But there's another side of it that is very mystical. It's related to taboo. You know, people don't have the language. They do sex. They do engage in sexual activity, but it's not something that people talk about. What we want is a sort of a happy medium between the two. And therefore, when we talk about homophobia, for example, it's all part of this spectrum of difficulty dealing with sex and sexuality. And I think the faith community has contributed to the phobia, the fear, etc. That's part of it. But I think we're also strategically placed to use the language of faith to change the quality and the nature of the discourse in sex and sexuality generally. But again, it comes back to how we care for each other. And therefore, since the language of sex and sexuality and the activity of sex and sexuality is out there already, so it's not that we're inventing anything. Also, I think this is a good time for us because now sex and sexuality is a public discourse.
Yes, it is.
And so the public has already set the agenda for us as a faith community. So we don't have to be afraid anymore to talk about it because it's out there. So what we need to do is to bring the discourse that will make it healthy and beneficial. And finally, you talk about young people. I think young people are far more liberated than most of us older people. And I think what we need to do in changing the discourse is really put them front and center and let them engage us in terms of how they understand it, and that we use their own language and nuances to lift the
Yes.
nature of the discourse.
The church have the power to change people's lives. Every church is a true church, and they believe in God, and they believe in the works of Jesus Christ. They have the power, the priests, and even the members of the church have the powers. Even self a man will come in the church. Nobody doesn't come in a church perfect. And if a man come in a church with an ungodly way of life, the church have the powers and the priests have the powers to change that person to become a child of God and to do the laws and the commandments of God.
The church is there to save people, not only there for the righteous, it's for the unrighteous. And the church is made up of all types of people, gays, transgenders, whatever they may be. And the church needs to recognize certain things because certain things are very taboo, especially in the churches. We don't want to talk about this, we don't want to talk about that, but it's evident we are living in it. So I think the churches should embrace everything. It's up to the individual because when you reach a certain age, you are responsible and you know right from wrong. And everyone have their own lifestyle. And it's not up to the pastor what. The pastor's supposed to tell you the right thing. But the ultimate goal is you know what you're supposed to do and the churches should embrace them.
Professor Landis, the 1990 targets have been set, and they've been set for quite a while now. And there are still some who believe that this cannot be accomplished by 2030, zero infections by that time. And many have tried to simplify it, to give the general audience an idea as to how this can be done. Are you in a position to break that down for us?
Yes. So let's just consider HIV and AIDS. Everybody thinks that HIV and AIDS is one and the same thing. It isn't. And HIV is a virus. It used to be a very scary virus, which there was no treatment for, and it killed you. Nowadays, HIV is, if it used to be a lion, it's now a little pussycat. It's scary in people's minds only. If you get treatment for HIV, you will never get AIDS. AIDS is what happens if you're not treated for HIV, and it happens just before you die. You have this awful syndrome where you're skinny and you have skin infections and gut infections and pneumonia. That is AIDS. There is no reason in the Caribbean for anybody to have AIDS. HIV, yes, it's a virus, but you can live with it now and live a very good life with HIV because the treatment is so good. There is no reason at all that anybody should have AIDS because all that's needed is to be put on treatment.
Professor Landis, I think you've simplified it and really broken it down because a lot of us have not been able to make that separation, draw the line between HIV and AIDS. And of course, getting treatment is fairly easy in 2017, but we still have that issue of stigma and discrimination. A lot of people do not get tested and they go through their life and they reach to that status of AIDS. So they have that horrible death.
Well, you know, the problem is now different. In 20 years ago, the problem was we had no treatment. Now we have the treatment, but people are too afraid to access it.
And that's the problem.
So the problem now is different. The problem really is these barriers. So what is standing between a person with HIV and getting treatment and having AIDS eliminated? It is fear, mostly. The fear in our society. I mean, we were afraid for good reason in the 80s. There was no cure, and people were dropping like 9 pins. But now, if you're treated, you lose less years of life than if you're a smoker. You lose less years of life than if you have diabetes. So it really isn't such a big thing anymore. But because of the fear in society, people are afraid to even get tested, to know their status. But I think if people knew that the treatment was so effective, I don't think they'd be so afraid. And then, of course, we've also, I think, stigmatized this disease, and we've pigeonholed it to certain populations. Now, in the Caribbean, we have a very mixed epidemic. So we have, roughly equal proportions of heterosexuals and homosexuals. We don't have much drug users, intravenous drug users, who have it, which is different from other parts of the world. And so, it doesn't really help to think about categories. It is a very simple issue. We need to stop, being so afraid, so that people know that they can get treated if they are positive. And we need to stop putting all these barriers in the way, this stigma and discrimination. I will give you an explanation as to another way to think about this. I think we've all heard that stigma and discrimination against any group is not right. And you know, this is deeply rooted in our Caribbean experience, you know, the colonial experience. I think we understand that discrimination is wrong against people. But the science actually gives you another reason how to overcome this barrier. And the science is this. If you're on treatment and you have HIV, you don't have any virus in your body that can be transmitted. Now, we know this from mothers who have HIV. And I'll give you the example of Barbados because I have those figures to hand. But many Caribbean countries are doing this very well. Mothers, of course, tend to know their status because in antenatal clinics, they get tested, and if they have HIV, they will be put on treatment. And if they're put on treatment, they will give birth to HIV-negative children. Yes. So in Barbados, in the last 8 years, we've had 180 mothers with HIV. They've been put on treatment, and we actually only have 2 births where a baby had HIV. So this is actually the elimination of HIV in children. We don't have children under the age of 10 with HIV anymore in Barbados. Now, this tells you that when a person who has HIV is treated, they cannot transmit it. But what about sexual transmission? If you have HIV and you're on treatment, what has been shown very clearly, and it's been shown by groups working in Africa, it's been shown by groups working in Europe, it's been shown in a randomized trial, it has been shown with absolute certainty. If you have HIV and you're treated and you have suppressed virus in your body, you cannot transmit this virus sexually. You cannot. And the authoritative study, which was reported in JAMA in 2016 by Alison Roger, it was 888 what are called serodiscordant couples. That is where one partner has HIV, the other partner does not. If this person who has HIV is on treatment, then they tracked what they call condomless acts of sex. So during the period of this study, they tracked 58,000 condomless acts of sex. Guess how much transmission there was from HIV-infected persons in this cohort to the uninfected partner?
Under 100?
None.
Wow.
0.
Wow.
So this changes everything. So previously, we used to say, treatment is fantastic for the person. It brings the person back from death's door to being healthy, and you have less loss of life than you would if you had smoking or diabetes. But now, we know that persons who have suppressed virus in their body are non-infectious. So that's a public health benefit. It means, and so what we talk about now is suppressing HIV at a population level. So the more people who know their status and the more people who are on treatment means that the whole level of HIV virus in the population comes down, and the entire population is now safe from transmission, or safer, depending on how much suppression you have. Now, I have the statistics in Barbados where 27%, this is where the 1990 comes in. What UNAIDS has recommended is that 90% of persons know their status.
That's right.
Of those 90%, 90% are on treatment. Of those 90% who are on treatment, they're taking their treatment well and their virus is suppressed. 90 times 90 times 90% means that 72.9% of the whole HIV population will be fully virally suppressed. The mathematicians tell us that at this point, the epidemic will die out, because there's just insufficient numbers of HIV-infected persons with high virus levels in the population. So if we achieve 90, 90, 90, there will be so little HIV virus still around in the population.
And not enough to flourish forward.
It won't transmit, and we can get to zero transmission. So the elimination of AIDS is almost instant. I mean, as soon as someone gets put on antiretroviral treatment, they will not get AIDS.
Professor Landis, I think the key element here is to get tested.
It is to get tested and not to be afraid. For us in society, what is the only impediment now? It is no longer the drugs. It is actually our own thoughts, our own words. It is our own actions that actually determine whether someone has the courage to go forwards, to get tested and to get linked to care, and therefore to have virus suppressed.
Brings it right back to stigma and discrimination.
And, you know, and if we have supportive attitudes, you know, I mean, when persons come to me, you know, and they have HIV and they're all distraught, you know, I mean, I support them. I say, you know, it's not a problem anymore. Don't be so afraid. Just get your treatment, and within, you know, a few weeks, maybe a month or so, you can see the difference is dramatic. People are healthy and well, and as far as the public benefit goes, that person is no longer infectious. So it is actually in our own interest as the public not to have these kind of negative thoughts and attitudes. It's in our gift to end this epidemic.
Sometimes, you know, you contract the disease unknowingly, you know, even though it is smart that you get to know somebody before you interact in such, you know, sexual activities. But the church should embrace you because, I mean, at the end of the day, you are human too. You know, however you come across getting the virus, it's not necessarily your fault. It happens, you know. So I think they should because, I mean, at the end of the day, you're human too. You know, and during times like that, people need support.
What contribution do you think that the gathering of the religious faith leaders or the faith leaders here in Trinidad and Tobago at this consultation, what do you think that they can bring to the table when it comes to the recommendations set by the UN High Level 2016 Political Declaration?
For us to go to the end of it. It's like today we are in a junction now, where one path may keep business as usual, and the AIDS epidemic will remain with us forever, as a threat mainly for the younger generations. The other path, that where the hope is, that we take all what we learned during 3 decades, the experience, the knowledge, and take that all together to go to the end of AIDS. In a nutshell, the science is working in favor of us. We never have so much progress in terms of drugs, technologies. What we are missing is what the drugs and the technology does not resolve. There are societies that are more tolerant, that do not discriminate, that deals with stigma. That's what's holding us behind. It's not HIV anymore. I started to deal with HIV in the beginning. I saw the first AIDS case in the world in the 80s. But we are not there anymore.
3 years ago, when the 90 targets were set, some said that it was not realistic. And just based on what you said, we are reaching closer to that goal, 2030, no cases of HIV or no infections. In terms of realizing that goal and reaching the masses and allowing them to understand what it takes to reach that goal, Professor Landis, he broke it down quite easily. Yeah. Has UNAIDS had any major obstruction in terms of moving forward?
It's again, take the case of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago has one of the largest coverage in terms of treatment, doing very well on that way. You know, as other countries in the Caribbean as well, in terms of providing more and more treatment to the people that needs it. You know, but on the other hand, as in the Caribbean, as in the rest of the world, infections continue to grow, mainly among young people, mainly in populations that we call key populations, yes, most vulnerable. Yes. Why this is happening? It's again, it's because drugs only will not resolve the problem. Even if we are going forward, we need to combine now a broader approach, a more holistic approach, where there is no place for discrimination, there is no place for stigma. And you know why? Because the person that is discriminated is stigmatized. They go underground. They don't come to the service.
They don't get treatment.
They don't get treatment. They don't get prevention. Yes. They don't get tested.
Yeah.
And that's where
The problem
the
is.
contribution of the faith base is so fundamental.
Yes.
I don't have the power to change societies. You know, we may guide, we may facilitate. The faith-based leadership, they do have this power.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Lewis, from UNAIDS perspective, do you think that more needs to be done in terms of getting the message across? Are we doing enough? We would have seen, like, within the last maybe 10 or 15 years, you would have had public education programs on HIV, getting tested, et cetera, but now that HIV is not what one calls a death sentence, we've slackened a bit, so you don't really see the public outreach or the messages continuously. So is it that we're not in their face? Do we need to push this 90-90-90 target or the 2030 agenda? Do we need to have a major global media blitz?
We do. That's one side. I think complacency is part of history. As you said, you know, before, the headlines every day were done by people, celebrities, and so dying with AIDS. Fortunately, it's not the case anymore, but it's not over. The epidemic is there. Each day, more and more, many young people get infected by HIV. That cannot continue. We need to resolve that. The media has an essential role on that, but more than ever, this needs to be an issue back in the conversations, in the families, in the schools, in the workplace, in the churches. That's what we are aiming for. That as it was one time in the past, for bad, because of the catastrophe of AIDS, we want this conversation back today, with the aim of protect the generations that are coming, give them the skills, give them the assurance that they will be not discriminated, they will be not stigmatized.
And that's hard though,
That's
very hard, but we need to start.
But we need to, and that's why we need a combination of using all what we can in terms of communication, using the media, using the social media, but more than ever, to have an environment where we are going to talk back about HIV.
Do you believe that the faith-based leaders, the religious communities, do you think that they can penetrate that barrier and have a wider conversation when it comes to stigma and discrimination?
You know well, they influence more societies.
Yes.
How societies behave, how society integrate any other stakeholder, any other sector in your societies. I think, and there is one point that we have in common that nobody can change that, and that's why I have hope. We are all working for the dignity of people. When I say that I work to save lives inside the UN, because that's my job, you know, to protect the dignity of people, to make sure that every human being is treated as the same, has the rights, has this dignity protected by all. Who can do better than the faith-based? That's what they believe. That's what we are learning from them every day.
Yes, it just need to embrace everybody. Yes, because Mary Magdalene was a prostitute and Jesus embraced her, so the church can't stigmatize anybody.
This is Caribbean to Zero, as we continue the fight against HIV and push forward to not only end HIV via the 1990 targets by 2030, but to work even harder to eliminate stigma and discrimination.